Miserably unhappy are not in deep suffering very often. I thought I might ask Sandy a little bit about happiness and whether he thinks that with all the material improvements in life and perhaps cultural and educational improvements, I don't know, there are some signs that people are not happier. And I wondered, Sandy, really what you felt about that. I mean, do you feel people are happier than they were? Or do you think, are you a bit more pessimistic than that?
Yes, well, good evening, everybody. Hello, Lance. But before I answer your question, if I could just say, tell you a little story about suffering, which you alluded to earlier on, and happiness. Some years back, I was on tour in the northern United States, and I was asked to go and speak to a class of students at a community college, their English course. Which was in addition to the signing that I was doing in that town. And I said, of course, I'd be very happy to do that. So I went along, and there was this class of English 1010 or whatever they call it. And at the end of this little talk, which was about being a novelist, I said, anybody want to ask me any questions? And that, of course, usually that question results in immediate silence. Which of course did ensue. And but after a while, a hand went up at the back, and this young man looked at me fairly intensely, and he said, "Have you suffered?" And I was taken aback by this question, and I realized it was meant seriously. I think that he was of the view that literature and suffering were inextricably linked, that you couldn't be an author unless you actually had suffered. You know, I think I can see that there is this connection.
So what he meant was, have you suffered enough?
Yes. So it does. I think, in fact, I remember reading somewhere, I think it was in the Paris Review many years ago, an interview with Gore Vidal, who had a sort of fairly waspish sense of humor and could certainly come up with very succinct and entertaining comments. He was asked his view of Solzhenitsyn, and Gore Vidal replied, "Gore Vidal," which I gather in Russian, he said, means he has suffered. so that's a little point about, actually, sorry, I don't want to waffle on, but a little point following on from that question from this young man, which I tried to answer as well as I could. I was then taken by the principal of this community college back out to the car park where my car was waiting. And as we were walking towards the car, this young woman ran up behind us from the class. She came and she said, "Excuse me, there was a question I wanted to ask there, but I didn't ask." So I said, "Oh, well, please ask it." And she said, "Do you like wild mushrooms?" And this was completely out of the blue. And I was completely taken aback. And I said, "Yes, but you have to be very careful about the picking of wild mushrooms," which seemed to satisfy her. And off she went. Now, it's possible I was missing some agenda in this question, that there was another agenda going on, but it was a very curious thing. So authors do get asked very peculiar things when they appear in public. Now, I must get to the point of your question, which was about happiness. And I think there's, if you consider where we are, which I suppose this question of whether we're happy really rather leads to that broader question. I think that there's an idea which is very, very widely believed in, that we should be happy, that we have to be happy, that somehow the good life is totally bound up with the notion of being happiness. And of course, there are very many famous statements of happiness as a goal, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and so on. It's written into major mission statements, as one might call things, if you call the United States Constitution and other such documents major mission statements. You'll find that happiness is seen as something that we should aspire to, and I suppose that is understandable enough, because most of us actually do want to be happy. We react negatively to unhappiness when we see unhappiness in others. But I think that it's probably been promoted as one of the absolute major values, which of course it wasn't in the past necessarily. In the past, I suppose that in many of the major religions, it wasn't so much happiness that was seen as being the principal goal, but enlightenment, for example, or freedom from the bonds of this world, if one's thinking of Buddhist traditions, or in Christianity, I suppose it would be approach to God, knowledge of God. You didn't necessarily have to be happy. Then I think along came a rather superficial attachment to the idea that we all have to have a happy face on us. Interestingly enough, this is a sort of rather odd observation, my side wind, so to speak. In photography, if you have your photograph taken now, you are told to smile, and photographers insist that you smile, and the photograph is regarded as a failure if everybody in it isn't showing their teeth in a broad smile. Now, that actually is a new thing, that in the earlier days of photography, you didn't smile, and that's why when you look at Victorian photographs, they aren't smiling. That's not because the Victorians were so unhappy that they never smiled. It's just nobody ever said cheese to them or expected them to say cheese and to smile. So I think this idea of happiness as being something that we all should be in a permanent state of is a curious one. It's almost, one thinks of Aldous Huxley and Soma in Brave New World. It's a sort of Soma equivalent that we have. Sorry, that's a very long-winded answer to your question.
No, I mean, it would a little glance over to your fiction. Anybody who's read your novels, which seems to be almost everybody, or at least some of your novels, will know that you specialize in good. I mean, the question of that student in the community college, had it been addressed to Samuel Beckett, would have been ludicrously obvious. But in your case, I mean, there's a sense in which you believe in goodness, the sense in which your characters are. They have problems, but the tone of their lives is not the tone of passionate suffering at all. And that's presumably where that question came from. I mean, you must be aware of that, and it's deliberate, obviously.
Yes, I think as an author, I don't think as an author one necessarily has an agenda, and you say to yourself, I'm going to be an author who's going to write a certain sort of book. So I think that let's take Graham Greene. I don't think that Graham Greene sat down when he started to write and he said, I'm going to write about seedy lives, or rather desperate lives on the periphery, with set underneath creaking fans in tropical settings and so on. I don't think he did that, and I think people tend not to do that. You write what you want to write, and I think that any successful novel has to proceed from a belief by the author that in what is being what is being written, because I think if it's meretricious, it will show.
Mm.
Indeed, if you decide, many people feel that they can write romantic novels for Messrs. Mills and Boon. If you write to Messrs. Mills and Boon and ask for their explanatory leaflet on how to write a Mills and Boon novel, that's the first point they make, because I've seen one of those leaflets, and it says, do you believe in this? You have to believe in this. Don't think that you can write a pastiche and get away with it, because the readers will immediately know. So I think, I think there can be people who can skillfully write in such a voice, but generally speaking, one writes what one wants to write, and you write what is in your heart, in a way, is another way of expressing that. And of course, if you look at people's novels, you'll see that they give away their deepest psyche in their novels. Every second sentence tells you something about what the author wants in this life, what the author's real ambitions, hopes, fears, etc. happen to be. So I didn't think I decided I want to write happy books, because I felt that that was something that would be well received. And I wrote in the voice in which I write, because that's what I feel, really. Mm. On the one occasion in which I have written darker material, where I have perhaps not taken the same sort of approach that I took in my later books, I think that shows, and the reason why I did that was because at the beginnings of my literary career, I was completely out of step with the zeitgeist, which was misery and conflict, confrontation, and a sort of rather in-your-face approach. And I felt that I wouldn't get published as a writer of fiction if I wrote something which didn't acknowledge those concerns. It showed, in my view, it wasn't me. I don't go back to that and read that with any real sense of identification or pleasure.
That's very interesting, Sandy. I hadn't quite realized that. I mean, it is your own voice. I know you well, and your voice is like the voice in your books, especially, of course, the sense of humor and the sense of humanity. Before we leave the suffering topic, I'm sure you know the story about the South African writer Roy Campbell, after he'd read a few Graham Greens and a couple of other of the sort of suffering novelists to whom you were trying to imitate, probably as a young man. And he came up with the line, if Jesus Christ had read these novelists, he wouldn't have died for the bastards.
Yeah, well, there we are. I mean, I think there are some very, very complex issues involved in this discussion. One of them is, of course, that literature generally should be a broad church, that it should actually address the distressing issues of our times. It should show the harsh face of our times, but it should also deal with other matters. I find consistently, I'm accused of being excessively optimistic. I'm accused of being a utopian novelist, very specifically. Some people have said, you know, you're a utopian novelist. I can see why they say this. But I think that shows an extraordinary view of literature or art in general, that art should only be concerned with the negative, with the various pathologies, individual psychopathology, social pathology, economic pathology, and so on. In other words, all the gritty, difficult aspects of life. Those actually have to be dealt with. But the view that literature that doesn't deal with that is somehow not serious and unworthy is an extraordinary one, but it is quite widely held. We've accepted that is what you should write. So people are very condescending sometimes to people who write in a different register from that misery register. The portrayal of...
I can easily imagine what you said there about writers portraying the harsh face of our age is, I think, a quotation from the Nobel presentation of the Nobel Prize for Literature to Samuel Beckett in 1969. I think that's where those words come from. Though no doubt they've been used elsewhere, and that exactly encapsulates it. I mean, no one's going to say that Samuel Beckett shouldn't have written. And equally, no, please God, no one's going to say that P.G. Wodehouse shouldn't have written. I mean, good heavens, all human life is there. I'm sure that's right. Moving on a bit from the matter of suffering, one of the aspects of your fiction and of you yourself is that I think you are interested in morality. And in a general sense, and perhaps in an old-fashioned, slightly Jane Austen-y sense, which I very much like. I mean, Jane Austen is a genius, and in her novels there's a background of morality, which perhaps is the sort of pattern that you might aspire to. But I've been reading Jonathan Haidt, H-A-I-D-T, The Righteous Mind, and it's a brilliant analysis. He's an evolutionary psychologist, and he has this brilliant analysis of how we are intuitively moral. And he says that our instinct towards morality has 6 dimensions. And the first 3, everybody agrees with. They are fairness, care, and liberty. So a child of 3 will say, that's not fair. We automatically know that if everyone's being given a chocolate biscuit and you're left out for no reason, it isn't fair. We also know that if Granny is not being looked after and is starving in the gutter, she's not being cared for. And we immediately feel sorry for a damaged animal. I mean, we have automatic care and fairness and some notion of liberty. Just everybody being enslaved and being told what to do, automatically we have a kind of revulsion against. But it's the other 3 instincts that Haidt mentions, which I would like to talk to you about now, because they are the less fashionable ones, and political correctness or wokeness is very big on fairness and care and liberty. Actually, people on the right wing are also keen on fairness and care and liberty, though they tend to mean slightly different things. But what the left wing, or the woke, or the new people who are dragooning our morality in the cancel culture, or in universities where you can say some things but not others, what they have forgotten about is that the other 3 instincts are equally strong, and they are loyalty, authority, and sanctity. I should say that Jonathan Haidt is a democratic speechwriter and a democratic voter, and he has the courage to say, look, you Democrats have got 3 of the instincts of human morality, but these other 3 are the preserve of conservatives only. And if you say, what we want in Britain today is more loyalty and more authority and more sanctity, I don't think you'd get elected. So you'd seem like you'd be called a fascist by the younger generation. Now, I just wonder, because I feel in your novels, and I know from you, that you have a high ideal of loyalty, and I think you don't mind that there be some traditional authority, and I think you think that there are parts of the world which can have or can be given or need to have some sanctity. Does that resonate with you?
Yes, it certainly does. I must say, Lance, that I some months ago, in fact, possibly even a year ago, I downloaded that book onto my iPad, my Audible iPad, but I haven't yet started to listen to it. But certainly I'm proposing to do that, particularly after your recommendation in those terms. Yes, I'm interested, I think, in virtue morality and in the virtues. And of course, that means that we have to recognize that there's a dimension to morality which contemporary thought sometimes misses altogether. Contemporary versions of morality which stress individualism and an individualistic agenda, and which are concerned with the feelings of people, understandably, because there, of course, one is in the territory of sympathy, which constitutes a very major part of our moral tradition. And certainly, if you look at Hume and the other philosophers of the Scottish Enlightenment, sympathy plays a major role in their ethical systems. And I think that sympathy is something that we naturally feel, and it's an important constituent of morality. But there are other virtues which should be ideally present in the virtuous life, which are less paid attention. You mentioned loyalty. I think that is one such. Also, I suppose there are morality should be concerned about improvement of the self, of one's nature, one's character. I think then we get into very interesting areas of the role of character in morality, which is a subject which I'm extremely interested in, and which I explore in my Isabel Dalhousie novels. Isabel being a moral philosopher. Responsibility for character is a very interesting question. Now, I think that a minimalist modern morality probably wouldn't say that we've got much duty to ourselves to become better. I think that they would say that that's not the point, and it doesn't really matter. You can so you can metaphorically remain in your pajamas for the whole day and not feel feel worried about it. But in fact, there is a dimension to morality which actually does attend to that. Now, my best known fictional character is Ma Ramotswe, Precious Ramotswe, who is a lady from Botswana, and she talks about the old Botswana morality quite a lot. She talks about the values that her father, in particular, the late Obed Ramotswe, embodied, she says that effectively, if you're looking for a moral guide in life, all you have to do is look at the old Botswana morality, and that'll keep you straight in all respects. But I think that what she demonstrates, and one of the reasons why I think she is a character who seems to have resonated with a large number of people, is that she manifests kindness in and she would also manifest other virtues. It's the virtues that we're concerned. So virtue ethics, I think, is an important corrective to the individualistic, rather narrow band of ethics that people have been.
Well, that's great, Sandy. Can I just say, I'm rather impressed, because without your having read Jonathan Haidt, one of his main points is that the three virtues which we all agree with, fairness, care, and liberty, are absolutely focused on the individual. And a substantial part of his book is devoted to focusing on what he calls groupish virtues, and groupish morality, which is precisely the sort of thing which requires loyalty to the group and authority for the head honcho or the father in Ma Ramotswe's case, and the sanctity of the places where the group meets or the it carries. And so it is that group notion which, astonishingly, considering the socialist tenor of so much modern thought, is supposed to be about groups. The minute you say, I think someone should tell these children what to do, people start referring to the Nazis.
I know. And that's really interesting. And I think you put your finger on a very major issue there. There was a period when people, I think, tried to address that apparent imbalance when there was great interest in communitarian ethics. And this is a couple of decades ago, 2 or 3 decades ago, there was an upsurge of interest in communitarianism. And I think that was an instinctive reaction against the excessive individualism of the morality that was available then, and the emphasis on rights. Now, rights are terribly, terribly important. And I think that, thank heavens, that we live in a time where human rights have some foundation, where there's people are ready to defend them, where they're part of the conversation that we have with one another. And of course, we don't have to go all that far back to a period when human rights really weren't thought of a great deal. Although, of course, I know you can go back. You can go back to the rights of man. You can go back pretty quickly. You're in the 18th century. But modern human rights, with their profound declarations in the UN declaration and so on are something which are really center stage at the moment. Now, I think that the problem is that talk about rights very rapidly can get hijacked by excessive individualism, and people talk about, you mentioned children, children's rights are important, that children should not be subjected to mistreatment, and you can couch that proposition in terms of children's rights, but at the same time you can very, very quickly turn it into a sort of Brat's charter. And that then also has exactly the effect that you talked about when you said that authority can be weakened there. The decline of the good authority is another big issue. And so what communitarianism, yeah, I agree that that you'd think that there would be more interest in communitarianism. People talk about community a lot, and they use it as a sort of shorthand for all sorts of things now, thereby depriving it of a lot of its real substance. In fact, I've even encountered somebody who tended to say things like, the community thinks that, when he was expressing his own view. he was talking about his own views, but he would use the community as the. But I think we want to get back to a greater sense of community. We're lonely. My goodness, we've been through a very lonely period over the last 2 years or so. But we are lonely in a mass world, a world where everything exists and functions on a very large scale. We feel we've lost our sense of belonging to a place, belonging to other people, as the bonds between people have been attenuated by the processes of the modern world, whereby you're not necessarily as reliant on people immediately around you. All of that has weakened our sense of community. Place, I think, is, you mentioned belonging to place, and that's another area of great interest of mine, which I think in the books I stress, feeling for place, which of course does have a spiritual dimension to it. Very quickly you can lead on to a discussion of spirituality when you're talking about place. Mara Motswe loves her country, Botswana, and she often in the books talks about her feeling for the land. And when I write about that, I'm just reflecting what is there. If you go and talk to people in that particular part of Africa about what they feel about the land, their intense love for the land will come out, their intense sense of belonging to that. And we all feel that to an extent for our place. But as that's weakened by the homogenization of the world, by globalization, which has brought certain benefits, but which nonetheless has destroyed the local. We see the destruction of the local. The local's the really important thing.
Well, yeah, I mean, as far ago as the 1890s, even the 1880s, one of the fathers of sociology, Durkheim, you remember him? Not much read, I think, these days, but he coined the notion of anomie.
Anomie, yes, yeah.
Which exactly what you've just described. Well, no norms, no laws that we. I mean, there are plenty of norms and lots of laws, far more than there were. But there isn't that sense of voluntary laws. I mean, I remember an aunt of mine who hated wearing hats, saying how much she liked the modern world. This was in about the 1960s, because she no longer had to wear a hat when she went to the Harrods.
Yes. Anomie, it's great to hear somebody referring to anomie. It's something that I remember having to read about as an undergraduate a very long time ago, theories of anomie, and I wasn't terribly interested in anomie at that stage because I'd never experienced it. And it's only later when I think that one becomes aware of that. Interestingly enough, there's another concept associated with that enemy, and that's a creation of an Australian social psychologist, and he coined a new word, solastalgia. It sounds like nostalgia, but it's solastalgia, solastalgia, and that is the feeling that we have when the world about us changes too quickly, and we lose familiar landmarks. Mm-hmm. And he discovered this when he was working with communities where there had been dramatic changes in the surroundings. So strip mining had come along and had flattened hills that people were used to having around them, for example, or cruel drought developed and people's gardens disappeared and the trees died, all of that. And he discovered that leads to a very considerable increase in the instance of clinical depression, that people become depressed because they've lost their sense of where they are, their sense of place. And you can actually quantify it. You can actually say, yes, the incidence of depression is such and such because of these changes. Mm. And interestingly enough, I've recently been reading a book by Robin Dunbar, who is a professor at Oxford, who's a psychologist and the great expert on friendships, on friendship networks. And the first chapter of his most recent book, which is simply entitled Friends, talks about loneliness. Obviously, that leads on to his discussion of how we combat loneliness through friendship networks. But he reminds us that loneliness has an intense consequence, serious consequence in terms of physical illness. That apparently the immune system does very badly if you're lonely, if you don't have friends and the company of other people. And the data is in on this. It's really interesting. Now that, of course, has major implications for where we are at the moment after this long period of loneliness. There's another iceberg of problems in terms of physical illness alongside all the other incidental problems which have resulted from this pandemic. But there's actually a legacy of physical illness through weakened immune systems, through loneliness. So again, that brings us back to community. That brings us back to how we define the self, which of course raises rather interesting issues about whether we're going to talk about the self or the soul, and what the connection between the soul and the self is.
Yes, well, we are, and that's absolutely right. I mean, and it's interesting that when you say to people, that change in the landscape is probably not good for people's mental health, lack of contact with other people is probably not good for their physical health. I think very few modern people are going to try and argue with you. I mean, you're right, the data is in, the statistics are there, but I think it's one of those almost like sort of moral instincts that we have, rather like the ones that Jonathan Haidt was talking about. You just know that people need people. And you just know that people need familiar landmarks. Yes. I mean, there's a kind of obviousness about that. And I feel a sense of pleasure in hearing about the Botswanans loving their land. I don't mean in a sort of nationalistic way so much as just loving the land. That's absolutely great. But can I say to people that I'm going to move on now to another topic. We've done suffering and we've done morality and one or two other things. But there is a chat going on, and if anybody wants to put things in the chat, I will gradually bring them up as Sandy and I go on. You don't need to wait, but you don't have to, of course. We are the Arthur Conan Doyle Centre is mind, body, and spirit. And we've touched on things which themselves touch on those. But there's something else that I'm just very interested in your views on, Sandy, and I'm sure everybody else is too. And that is, we've been talking to some extent about the transpersonal. I mean, morality is obviously transpersonal. And then there's something like interpersonal. We've been talking about the interpersonal, but then there's a question of, is there anything beyond that we could call the transpersonal? I'm sorry, I got that the wrong way around. The interpersonal is how we're talking to each other now, who's listening, what we're saying, what everybody thinks about it, and what we're going to say to our spouses later on, and how we treat people in the morning. as we drive our cars to work or whatever it is. But the transpersonal is a claim that there are other things perhaps still connecting people, or other things beyond people in the universe, which are sometimes, I suppose, called spiritual and so on. And I wonder where you are on that, and whether you feel any of your writing. Can I just say something about Sandy's writing? I don't know whether others have noticed it, but his novels could be regarded as moralities. They could be regarded as comedies, because they're often extremely funny. They could be regarded as studies in character, all sorts of things like that. But they are, and I absolutely agree that you don't have to be, tragic to be serious. So they are serious in their own degree. But if you read Sandy's verse, of which he's published less, you will find that it's not satire. There's some funny things, but it's not comedy in quite that same way. So I'd make a kind of claim that Sandy's more spiritual side, although it might be hidden or available through topics such as morality and suffering in his fiction, or the nature of happiness, that in his verse you will find that there are, let's put our cards on the table and say, indications of a more spiritual dimension, which is of interest to you as well. Can we go to that place, to the transpersonal?
Certainly, yes. Well, thank you for your kind words there, Lance. I think the poetry, and you and I have discussed this in another context fairly often, that the important thing about poetry is that it distills feeling, that it allows for an intensity of feeling, and I think that's what sets poetry, the principal thing that sets poetry apart from prose. So I think it's perhaps not surprising that when I've written poetry, I have been able to address more directly matters which one might describe broadly as spiritual, in a very broad sense. I still think that I do that in the other books. That does happen, but the very nature of prose means that you have to be careful not to become too intense, because that will disturb the narrative. You do have to remember that prose is doing a narrative job, and that people are expecting a tale to be told, and that if you have too much delving into matters of the soul, or indeed of the self, if you want to use that term, then people are going to start sighing and closing the book. So I think poetry does lend itself to that. Your broader question about the role of the transpersonal, yes, I think that there's a limit to how far you can go in a spiritual sense if you are solely concerned with relations between individual persons. You can go some distance, and you can go some distance if you're writing about love, for example, or indeed friendship. I probably write about that quite a lot. I'm very interested in the concept of friendship, and I explore that a lot in a lot of my fiction, I think. So you're approaching, if you're writing about friendship, you're writing about, you're heading in that direction. You're heading towards a sort of spiritual feeling. If you're writing about love, you're talking about an intensity of feeling that somebody has for another person. But then it stops, because it's still in the realm of the interpersonal, and you then have to take the next step to look at the further spiritual side to it. Now, music, of course, is free of those constraints to an extent, in that music can soar beyond the particular. So with music, we don't have to justify, or don't have to explain the feeling that the music is conveying. We may find that it may be programmatic music, and maybe it may reflect a place or a sequence of events or whatever, but there's something, music's got that additional dimension. as is poetry, in a sense, feeling. So we're talking about feeling of valuing something, feeling of awe in the face of something, feeling of union with something. All of that we feel. These are inner feelings that we have, which we can use the word spiritual to describe, but we all have them. Moments of mystical insight are an extreme example of that, where people experience a sense of mystical oneness with the world. All of those, I think all of those are clearly present in our lives. A lot of people would reject them, would say that they don't exist, that they just happen to be emotional states which are explicable in terms of chemical reactions within the brain. Okay, you can reduce them in that way, but I think that all exists, and I'm interested in exploring that in my writing, and I think we get moments. I mean, there's one, thinking of in the #1 Ladies Detective Agency series, where Mama Cootsy's brother dies of AIDS. And I don't use the word AIDS because there were very particular reasons why I didn't put that disease center stage in those books, although Botswana was gripped by a terrible onslaught of HIV and HIV-related deaths back a couple of decades ago. But I have there's a scene where Richard, Mama Cootsy's brother, dies in the hospice in Botswana, and Sister Banjuli, who is the nurse, sympathetic nurse who runs that, and we describe how she tends to him and how she washes him on his deathbed, and how his life didn't amount to very much. He wasn't a man who'd done very much or achieved very much, but nonetheless was extremely precious to her, very meaningful to her. And so you can actually use prose and a narrative to say, look, catch your breath at this and think, what is this? What are we talking about here? We're talking about, similarly, when you describe agape, which I think is a very interesting concept. There's a wonderful poem by Auden where he describes sitting on deck chairs with colleagues when he was teaching at a school out in the night under the stars, and he describes that as a moment of mystical insight in his part. Suddenly he realized how much he loved these people. There was no sexual element in it. It was just pure agape. It was a vision of agape. And I think in literature, in writing, you can draw people's attention to the possibility of those insights. It's quite hard to do, but you can do it. And I think people are receptive to it because we want to believe in something. We want to value the world. We do value it. We feel the sense of love for the world.
Do you feel that, I mean, I suppose we're getting closer to the $64,000 question, which I probably will never ask, about the biggest meanings, but do you feel that there's any, we use the adjective spiritual a lot quite freely, although we have slight questions about it sometimes. We have the non-linear and other synonyms, but do you, if you turn it back into a noun and talk about spirit, and I don't just mean, the spirit in a good rugby team or something like that, but spirit as something which is actually an energy in the universe, not necessarily measurable by the instruments of science. Do you feel that you would subscribe to that you think there are such energies in the universe other than gravity?
Yes, I think I probably would, broadly speaking, subscribe to that, and that I think there is something which is, and this is where it becomes very difficult to choose quite the right words. And I think that you can use various words to describe that. Many people use the word God to describe that. And if that is their way of clothing that feeling, that recognition, that's fine. And then, of course, people will come along and say, oh, well, you know, that's a naive idea that there's a figure, an individual figure who pays attention to our individual wants and implications and so on. So I always feel very uncomfortable about claims for absolute and universal truth in that department. I find it extraordinary that people can claim that their view of what lies behind our everyday reality is the sole and exclusively right one.
Yes.
That's absolutely, you know, that seems to me to be extraordinary. So to make such a claim.
Yes.
Now, they may have to make it for practical reasons because people need to have some sort of mythopoeic thinking in order to cope with these big questions, and that's okay as long as it's a tolerant expression of that. But the problem is that religion very quickly becomes intolerant the moment it's institutionalized. Some religions are less intolerant than others, but we've got some very intolerant religions. So I'm always very, very worried about that. But yes, I think there is a sense of how would one put it? I mean, sorry, I'm floundering here because we are dealing with such elusive concepts. But
I know. Well, you've got a compliment in the chat. Pauline Morgan has said that your idea of clothing a feeling in a word is beautifully put. And that really, you know, it's really good because you then can, on occasion, perhaps talk about spirit or talk about God. But if you know that it's only clothes, then that takes some of the heat out of it or some of the difficulty out of it. So you're getting a big tick there. Could I ask Scott to unmute Peter Bruin, please, because I want him to ask his question because I don't understand it. And while Scott's doing that, could I just take you to the chat? You will see that one of our favorite participants, Suzanne Taylor, has been doing podcasts, and her latest podcast, as you'll see at the very top of the chat, is about happiness. Who wouldn't like to be happier? And you've got the link there in the next moment. And as far as you're concerned, Peter, I'm interested in what you're interested in your question of 807, Sandy's view of where the author stands in the universe of consciousness. Do you mean because the author is the consciousness of the novel, or is it something more sophisticated than that?
I was going to go back earlier than that, Lance, to start, if I may, and then come round to that. Is that okay?
Okay, that's fine.
Because I love the earlier part of the talk. I loved all of the talk, but it seems to me that the worlds in which you set your books are exactly the same kinds of worlds as that of E.F. Benson's Map and Lucia books and the Jane Austen books. They are very specifically and narrowly defined cultural universes where the laws of the game are very strict. Yeah. And if you break the laws of the game by raising a teacup slightly too highly, or putting your pinky up slightly too high, you know, moral punishment can descend upon your head, and that's why I get very upset at the current cultural notion of cultural appropriation, because clearly you are a dreadful man for doing that in the #1 ladies detective books. And we've got to a point in the cultural debate where Sebastian Faulks is no longer writing female characters, and at that point I just want to give up, because I don't know, I don't understand this world. The world is turned upside down, and the left and right you talked about, Lance, isn't my left or right. I'm left wing, but I detest the woke stuff for the most part. I think it's a tiny end of a very large dog. trying to wag that fantastically large canine. And you know, if we're to progress at all, culturally, intellectually, perhaps even ecologically, we have to solve that problem just now. We have to solve that paradox. So I'm moving on from that to, you know, your very particular authorial voice, which creates those wonderful books. I mean, I really do love them. I love the Map and Lucia books as well, by the way. But, you know, it's, we've been mostly talking about consciousness in our work for the past 2 years in these talks. And I think in your last talk, we hit a point where, you know, in trying to determine it and define it, we understand that, you know, consciousness preceded materialism. And at that point, I wonder how you, as a material author, deals with the concept that it's coming through your brain from somewhere else and perhaps is not coming out of you. Does that make any sense?
Yeah. No, Peter, that's very, very interesting. I'm aware of the consciousness debate. I mean, I've read a certain amount about it. I'm no expert in it, but I've looked at these issues of consciousness, and it does seem to me that the issue is one that philosophers have not yet settled, and that obviously we can argue about the nature of human consciousness till the cows come home. I think what really interests me about what you said there at the end of your question about the source of the story, of the narrative, the source of the words, whatever, that's really, really interesting, because I think that fiction comes to a very great extent from the subconscious mind. I feel that really quite, and I have actually given quite a bit of thought to that, in that I think that I see it when I'm writing. I don't sit there and consciously make up what is going to happen on the page. I do, to an extent, have a general notion of which way things are going to go, or of what situations I might be addressing, and what characters I would be bringing in. But then a curious thing happens, and I don't, my subconscious takes over, and I don't have to think as I write. That's a very dangerous thing for an author to write, because people are going to say, oh yes, it shows. But I think I sit at the keyboard. That's the way I compose. I sit at the keyboard, and it's almost as if I'm acting as a medium for something else. It comes out, and it comes out very quickly. It comes out very specifically at the rate of 1,000 words an hour. It's quick. So I'm not sitting there agonizing, and certainly not sitting there suffering, Pache, what this poor student in the United States felt. So I think that that's coming from the mind, the subconscious mind, which is examining possibilities and which is playing around with them. Because I think the human mind is always asking what if questions. When we perceive anything, we actually go through a what if process, or we go through a process of elimination. If I look at a chair, I think, that's a chair, and I've eliminated table or city or whatever in the process. So a lot of this cogitation is going on in a subconscious way. Now, where does that come from? That comes, you could say, well, that comes from that's experiential. That comes from experience, from what you've heard, seen, felt, all of that. Jung, I think, would if you were a Jungian, you'd say that there are other sources for that, and that there's some sort of plugging into a collective unconsciousness. I'm not sure about that, but
well, I mean, there's another question which I think is Peter's question, but it's already been asked in the chat by Pip. Given the context of tonight's talk, when you're writing, do the words and ideas just flow to the point where you might think someone from spirit is inspiring you? Look at the word spirit and inspiring; it's the same word. Would you go that far?
I don't think I would. But what I would say is that on that, and indeed on so many other issues, one has to be open to discussion of that. I don't think I'm. I know people talk about channeling somebody else who's in another dimension. I'm not aware of that, and my instinct would be to say no. I don't hold with that.
There are famous examples, but they're quite rare.
Yeah. I'm not really. I haven't really considered that very much, and I don't think that. I don't think that there's anybody there that is suggesting things to me in that way. I think what I would say is that I would, before I write something, I may get into a mood to write it, and I might allow myself to be influenced by spirit of place or by very broad thoughts about how we are to comport ourselves or what we feel about, or indeed by music. And that, I think, is quite common, that many authors write with music there to assist them in the process. So, for example, when I'm writing my Isabel Dalhousie novels, which is an Edinburgh series, as I mentioned, Isabel is a moral philosopher by profession. Her world I get in touch with by playing the wonderful trio from Mozart's Così fan tutti, the Soave sia il vento. May the wind that carries you on your voyage be a gentle one, the breeze. May all your aspirations come to fruition. And it's the most gorgeous piece of music. It's a soaring piece of music, absolutely lovely when the male voice comes out above the other voices at the end. And that's directly inspirational for me. And that's getting in touch with some sort of feeling of spirituality, I think.
That's lovely. You're not quite like because you're more open to these things, but you remind me a little bit of George Eliot when she was translating Feuerbach's Das Leben Jesu, which is a completely anti-theological, ordinary biography of Jesus, as though he had nothing to do with God and he should, not taken seriously. And this is her being a sort of mid-19th century agnostic and translating this rather heavyweight book. And in order to inspire herself, she found herself looking up at a crucifix on the wall of her study, where the suffering Jesus was being put to death, and feeling inspiration from it to write this book, which reduces Jesus just to normal human level. So I think we're in the modern world, we're in that kind of very tentative, borderline between believing and unbelieving, or being prepared to talk about these things in more religious or spiritual terms. Certainly. And could I just say one thing, just going back to your poetry, Sandy, which is that I myself have, many people on this call I'm sure have had occasional, these peak moments, peak experiences, where everything goes golden and, the world is perfect and there's nothing not to like, even the people in the street all look lovely. And all I can say is they're probably the things I have most wanted to write about. And they're the things about which I'm absolutely least capable of writing. And whenever I've tried, the banality is absolutely I think probably sexual encounters and meeting the divine are the two things you shouldn't really try and write about. Yes. I think that's right. I noticed that Suzanne Taylor mentioned in the chat mentions Bernardo Castra, but do you know anything about his work? Because he's turned into an idealist. He really does think that the ideas come first and matter follows, and that consciousness is in some way primary in the universe, and that we've got it the wrong way around. Perhaps that's too heavy a philosophical question for this conversation, unless you have a reaction.
No, no.
Well, I think you're absolutely allowed not to have. And I don't think we're going to go the whole length till 9 o'clock, because I have to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that I know that Sandy has had a very long day. And when I tell you that he's had a very long day, closeted with his accountant. Am I right?
Well, I did have a meeting with the accountant, but I've got a very happy accountant. I think we were talking about happiness, and
Yes.
I've got an accountant who's very cheerful. You know, they say who described economics as the dismal science?
Science, yes, that it's John Stuart Mill or someone like that.
Exactly right. Yeah, yeah. Well, accountancy, I suppose, would be have the same accusation leveled against it, but not.
But he's a happy chap. But I mean, aren't you a bit worried to have a happy accountant? I mean, you know.
Well, no, he's philosophical, balanced. You know, and I think in a way one of the major challenges that faces each and every one of us is to what extent are we going to worry? How much of our psychic energy is going to be consumed by worry? Now, there's some people who are utterly consumed by worry. They contemplate the state of the world, and quite understandably, they reach rather grim conclusions about it. It's difficult to be positive about some aspects of the world. In many respects, the world is a vale of tears. But I think that there's no point in remaining there with in the vale of tears frame of mind, but actually trying to do something about it, trying to work towards the antithesis of that. I think Camus' famous Myth of Sisyphus essay makes that point quite strongly, where he says we can't answer the question about the meaning of life, and all we can do is find meaning within a limited context, and therefore try to bring about some form of decency where cruelty exists, and so on, where trying to make things better. It sounds a little bit simplistic, but nonetheless it's true. So I don't think that we should spend our time bemoaning our fate and bemoaning the fate of the world, because that isn't going to lead to the sort of engagement that is the only way out of our plight. So, for example, if we said, well, the world is awful, everything has gone to the dogs, what we see is ecological disaster, suffering, impossible odds against the human species, we may as well just pack up shop and we won't do anything about it. We won't feel inclined to do anything about it. We may well retreat into selfishness. And I think there are people who do that. They say, well, nothing can be done. And therefore, I'm going to adopt an I'm all right, Jack approach. I'm all right. I'm going to look after myself, and I'm not going to engage with the world's problems. That I think is very undesirable.
Yes, and the first thing you said there, that was really interesting. It reminded me quite a lot of Eckhart Tolle, the modern mystic. I always thought it was a wonderful coincidence that his parents had called him Eckhart, but they hadn't. He took it on later.
Oh, did he? Right.
Yeah. He called himself Eckhart, which is quite a thing to do,
Yes.
But you know that his great book is called The Power of Now, and he's very keen that we should be alert and we should concentrate on where we are now, being, rather than, or as you said, all this worrying, stretching out, regrets about the past, anxieties about the future, and so as it almost not living in the now, which is the only place we can live, because we have this mind, which perhaps overdeveloped mind in evolution, which is able, because it's so clever, to worry about everything that it possibly wants to. But I wondered, to bring us back to you, I just wondered, I was thinking the other day, reading a novel, that when one is absorbed in a novel, in a curious sense, you do some thinking, but mostly you're following in the now, that it's almost like a meditation, your other worries and your other thinking is taken away, and you're focusing on what's happening and how it's being written and so on, following the story along. It is a kind of meditative experience.
Yes, I think that's right. I think that so many of us aren't living in the present because we're encouraged, very specifically encouraged, through the encouragement of our material appetites to think in terms of the future. So it's inevitable, if you are encouraged to consume, to acquire more things, you are going to be looking to the things you will have in the future, rather than appreciating what you have now. And that, of course, is exactly what, say, the world of fashion does. The world of fashion doesn't say to you, be totally content with that lovely old jacket that you've got. It will last you 15 years, and you can probably pass it on to somebody through an Oxfam shop at the end of that, and they'll get 15 years out of it. The world of fashion says, don't wear that jacket too long. You're going to be terrifically yesterday. In fact, so yesterday that you will be tragic, and that therefore you need to. So this consumerism is a pretty distracting force, really, in a sense. And it's endemic. It's around us all the time. We're encouraged to go on to the next thing, to get the next thing, particularly. And that, of course, would be another ground on which you would say materialism has a lot to answer for. And again, there, of course, the Buddhists were absolutely right when they said that the material appetites can never be satisfied. They can't. They can't. And if one's going to couch that in terms of happiness, you're destined to be unhappy, because you'll never have all the things you want.
Absolutely, Sandy. And you'll be pleased to know that Peter Bruin has said, clearly your classic jacket, the one you're wearing now, proves that you nobly practice what you preach.
It is really, this jacket is at least 20 years old.
Excellent. The fashionistas must hate you, dear boy. I have to say, I'm going to end with a couple of things here. One is from Pip. I'm sorry, Pip, because I am very fond of Great Expectations, whose hero masculine is called Pip. I assumed you were a boy until I saw you in the box there, but you're not, and you are very keen that people should be happy. And you say that you're saying so true to Sandy and the matter of the veil of tears. And you're suggesting that we shouldn't give in to the veil of tears. We can stay happy. We can spread happiness, and happiness is contagious. I'm sure that's true, and it's a lovely thing to say. And I mean, we do all try. And I find if I smile at people, they're nicer to me, and then I'm nicer to them. I mean, it really does work that way. But the reason I'm bringing up that is not only because I want to tell Pip how much I agree with her, but because I think that Sandy's books make me happy. I mean, going right back to the very beginning. I mean, you select a book off the shelf because you're in a particular mood. And if I need cheering up, one thing I can do, I'm lucky, I can phone Sandy and we have a chat. He always cheers me up, and it's always a good laugh. But the comedy and the morality and the decency of Sandy's books always makes me feel better. And I mean, that's quite a function for fiction, and I'm sure a spiritual one. I don't know whether anybody wants to make a comment on that, or Sandy wants to respond.
Well,
you would have been mentioned in the chat. Well, yes. Anybody? No? Has anybody got a hand up or anything? Well, ladies and gentlemen, I think we're going to have to let Sandy off.
Can I, Lance, sorry, a final little story? May I tell a little story?
Please tell a little story. It's what you do for a living.
your talk about the infectious nature of happiness, and how there's a wonderful story which was told me by Robin Harper, who used to be the leader of the Scottish Greens, who's a man who is well known for his very, very cheerful smile. Robin is a very nice man, and he has this very appealing, cheerful smile. And he said he was walking up Morningside Road, heading into town one morning, and it was very early, there weren't many people around, and there was this man coming down the opposite direction on the same pavement as Robin. And Robin said that he smiled at this man and he said, good morning. And I can just see Robin doing that. And he has a very infectious smile. And the man looked at him like this, and then he said, okay, good morning, but I'm not voting for you.
It only goes so far, Pip. Doesn't carry you right through to the ballot.
It doesn't, no. But it's still worth doing. It's still worth saying good morning to people, even if they aren't going to vote for you.
Well, I find I carry it a bit far because I'm rather inclined to smile at dogs, and I don't think they recognize what's happening. Hello, I say to dogs. Maybe that really is a bit much.
Well, let's not go too far into that, but I can tell you, Lance, that you're making a fundamental mistake there, that in dog body language, showing your teeth is very dangerous.
Yes, of course.
We've got it wrong.
I have to wag my tail, do I, or something?
Yes.
Well, Peter Bruin wants to sign off on Sandy's books make me happy and uplifted and informed. So many other books are like the literally equivalent of fast food. Swift pleasures soon followed by a deep emptiness. And I feel that is true in so many things, although, yes, anyway, people are saying nice things, and I would like to add my nice things, Sandy, and thank you very much for talking.
Well, thank you.
And we can all go off and smile at our spouses and perhaps have a little drink. And thank you, everybody, for coming along. And I hope you'll see me. I'll be chairing next week an interesting American called Charles Eisenstein, who has much to tell us, which is going to be, I hope, very interesting. So perhaps see you next week. And thank you, Sandy.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye-bye.
You have the traditional silent hand clap. We always enjoy that. Okay. And I'm going to shut you all out. So I'm very sorry. Goodbye.